Today, touchscreens are commonplace in almost every new car. And in some cases, the touchscreens are so large and are so expansive that they control almost every function within the vehicle itself. It seems as though customers have become increasingly comfortable with touchscreens since they certainly have become more numerous in vehicles as the years have gone on. However, back in the mid-1980s, Buick division tried introducing what it called its Graphic Control Center, or GCC, which was effectively a CRT touchscreen that controlled numerous vehicle functions from the middle of the instrument panel. It was a device that was almost universally panned by critics as well as customers, and it would vanish from Buick interiors after a few short years. However, let's explore a bit more about the 1986 Buick Riviera and this GCC, Graphic Control Center, why they introduced it, what its positive features were, as well as its shortcomings. In the mid-1960s, all the way through about the 1970 model year, Buick division was getting a reputation for producing vehicles that could captivate the minds of younger buyers. It did so largely on the back of the introduction of GS model trims in the 1965 model year, and arguably the hottest Buick sports car in 1970 with the Buick GSX. However, after the 1975 model year, Buick really didn't have much in the way of sporty cars in its lineup after having dropped the Buick Century GS, which, by the way, in its last year was nothing more than a trim package. It wasn't long before Buick division started getting a reputation for producing vehicles that catered to, shall we say, an elder crowd. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Buick division's management changed, and Lloyd Royce, who would later become GM president, was installed as the head of Buick Motor Division. Lloyd's vision for the division was to change it into a division that really embraced performance and technology. Thus, as the late 1970s rolled on, you would see such technological innovations in Buicks like turbocharged engines, including turbocharged 3.8 liters under the hoods of Buick Regals. These would later evolve into the famous Buick Grand National and GNX cars in the 1980s. Buick would also introduce the T-Type badge in 1981, first bestowing it upon the 1981 Buick Riviera. Presumably, the T stood for turbocharged, and while not all cars in the Buick lineup that were T-Types got a turbocharged engine, that's really where its nomenclature began. And as the mid-1980s arrived, the T-Type trim could be had on pretty much any Buick vehicle, including the lowest entry car, the Skyhawk, where it actually did still have a turbocharged 1.8-liter four-cylinder engine. However, Buick did bestow the T-Type badge upon one vehicle that would introduce one of the most infamous pieces of technology in 1980s automotive history, and that was the Buick Riviera. This new for 1986 Riviera was significantly downsized from the 1985 Riviera it was replaced. It was a product of GM's corporate planners thinking that fuel prices were going to be the equivalent of roughly $5 per gallon when the car was introduced in 1986. Alas, that prediction certainly didn't come to be, with fuel prices decreasing in real terms almost every year throughout the mid-1980s, to the point that when the pint-sized Riviera was introduced for the 1986 model year, this 108-inch, 3,300-pound vehicle was not very well received by the public, particularly for those who were trying to trade in from their earlier 1975 to 85 Buick Riviera that was on a 114-inch wheelbase and was about 3,900 pounds. Sales figures plummeted precipitously from the 1985 Riviera, 64,000 units sold, to about 22,000 units sold in 1986. And while designers tried to bestow this new pint-sized Buick with some flair and overall excitement, it really was just too small of a package for many buyers to perceive the car as being the dramatic car that they had come to expect from the Riviera. However, while the exterior designers really struggled to make the 187-inch 1986 Riviera something that was quite dramatic and had a presence from the outside, the interior designers, led by Paul Tadzias, tried their best to endow the interior with not only a fair amount of space, given the small package, but also a high level of technology. And the centerpiece of this technology would be at the middle of the instrument cluster, and that was Buick's GCC Graphic Control Center. As you'll notice in the center stack of these 1986 Rivieras, there aren't any climate control buttons that you can push to engage the heater or the air conditioning, nor are there radio buttons or dials that you can touch to turn on the radio or listen to your favorite song. All climate control and radio functions were to be controlled by the CRT, requiring a driver to move their glance from the road to the CRT to depress a rather small button to effect change to either one of these systems. In addition to climate control and radio, the GCC also enabled drivers to see a series of gauges, including an RPM gauge that helped determine what was going on with the vehicle. And the GCC also offered a full diagnostic mode that customers could try to examine what was going on with their vehicle in the event of problems. Lastly, the GCC also included a full trip monitor function. It really was quite the technological achievement for the time, and unlike anything that was in other vehicles. And that's really what hurt the GCC, in addition to its challenging functionality. Buick, however, was really committed to changing public perception about the system and stuck with it through the 1989 model year in the Riviera as well as the Buick Riviera, before eschewing it completely with a revised instrument panel in the 1990 model year. Perhaps some of this commitment was the product not only of stubbornness, but also the desire on behalf of Buick Division's bean counters to amortize the costs of what was probably a very expensive development cycle for the CRT over at least a number of model years before it could be sunset. And once it departed, the automotive press, critics, and customers alike generally praised Buick for throwing the GCC into the proverbial trash bin. However, in looking back at the GCC today, where so many cars now have touchscreens all over the place and increasingly large displays, it's interesting to reflect on how challenging individuals found this system to use when it now is such commonplace in many vehicles. I think the principal difference between the CRT that Buick employed in the mid-1980s and current touchscreens is simply the size and the functionality with which one can employ them. Perhaps if the CRT had been able to be 17 plus inches, as is the case with some in-vehicle displays today, it would have been more successful because the buttons could have been made to be larger. But I don't know about anyone else on this channel. I still find some of the touchscreen displays in today's cars relatively temperamental and challenging to use relative to buttons and dials that you can almost operate by tactile feel alone without moving your eyes off the road. However, it clearly appears as though I'm in the minority as more and more vehicles have more and more of these touchscreen systems. But it really all started back with the 1986 Buick Riviera and its graphic control center. Thanks again for watching this feature on the 1986 Buick Riviera and its GCC, or graphic control center. Hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you.